Saul and David, these two principal figures in the, well, really the founders of the monarchy. Saul, the first king, and David, the second, who succeeded him and became the great king. And then, of course, there was Solomon, the successor. Those three were the kings of the united monarchy. But when Saul began his reign, it would be hard to call it a united monarchy. He had some tribal loyalties. Of course, he had his tribe of Benjamin. They supported him. And he had, at best, kind of a lukewarm support by some of the other tribes. But eventually, because of victories the Lord gave him over the Philistines, these invaders from the Greek islands, the Aegean, realized the Greeks were dislodged from their homeland, and they settled in various areas in the Middle East, but one settlement was down on the coast of this land called Canaan. And eventually you have the 5 great cities of the Philistines. You have Ashkelon and Ashdod on the coast. And then farther south, I bet you've heard of Gaza. Gaza, okay? And then inland you had the city of Ekron, and then you had the city of Gath. And I bet you know the name of a Philistine hero from Gath. Yeah. Goliath.
He's a loser.
The Philistines were a real competitor for this land. You may have realized that the land of Israel is right in the middle of a lot of traffic. It's the junction of Africa, of Asia, and Europe. Isn't it interesting that the Lord put the Israelites right in this land bridge, the land between? Now, the problem with being in the land between is you do have a lot of traffic, and there are a lot of people who would like to control it. The Philistines, as they came onto the coast and settled, they began to feel a little bit of insecurity because they're right down there on the coast. Their backs are to the sea, and up above them in the hill country are the Hebrews. And they would have to feel more than a little insecurity with this. What they want is to have a real secure home. They were driven out of their own. They don't want to be driven out again. So sure enough, the Philistines start moving up into the hill country. See, to get up onto the high ground, advantageous to have the ridge that you control, but the Hebrews are there. And so inevitably, you're going to have conflict. And in that conflict, it ratchets up and gets worse and worse. In the days of Saul, the Philistines are making a real bid to take over. There will be a land of the Philistines, and that's all there'll be. The Hebrews will be displaced. Who do you think are named after the Philistines today?
Palestinians.
The Palestinians. Do we have a struggle over the control of this land? The Middle East is just one big circle, it said. What comes around goes around. What we're seeing today is a later chapter of what had happened earlier. And this time, in this earlier story, in the days of when Saul was a young man, the Philistines were in a great position to actually seal the deal, as it were, and dominate the land. They had a remarkable military, tight organization. And they were up against the Hebrews, who were kind of a motley crew, mostly farmers and herdsmen. Their boys grew up learning how to herd sheep and maybe do a pretty good job with a slingshot. The Philistine boys grew up with a sword in their hands, a bow, how to fight. They were trained to be soldiers. That was the Greek tradition. Have you ever read the Iliad, Odyssey? The Greek tradition. The Philistines, they come from that tradition. So in the early engagements, the Philistines they're getting the upper hand here. Then Saul comes along and tries to stem the tide, and he does begin to stem the tide. But a crisis. The Philistines are going to try to follow Caesar's military strategy called divide and conquer. That's a pretty sound military strategy. Where the sun is setting behind us, if we go up here out of the Ein Herod Valley, and behind me you can see the Jordan Valley, down there, well below sea level. We come up here above us to the Jezreel and keep going directly west into the setting sun, and you wind up at approximately Haifa. The Philistines decide, we will cut this land in two. From the coast all the way down here to the Jordan Valley. If we cut it in two, guess what? Naphtali, and Zebulun, and Asher, and Issachar, and Dan are up to the north, and down here is Judah, and Ephraim, and Manasseh. So the Philistine strategy is to make sure they control this valley, the Jezreel, and this is the Ein Harod extension of the Jezreel Valley. And here's our city, Beit that controls and guides it, or I should say, really controls this valley. Well, Saul realizes that this is the hour, this is the moment. If the Philistines get away with this, they can just sort of piecemeal strangle the Israelites. So he's got to somehow dislodge the Philistines out of the Jezreel. The problem is the Philistines have chariots, the equivalent of the modern battle tank. The Hebrews have none. And this is going to be a very difficult assignment. So what Saul did was he took his troops to the one place where he could at least be secure against chariot attacks. And that's up on Mount Gilboa, which is back behind us. I think tomorrow as we motor across from Nazareth, we can at least see it in the distance. Very classically shaped, kind of an easy slope up, and then there's this hump, Mount Gilboa. So he took his troops up there on Gilboa, and this is going to be Saul's last stand. I'll read the outcome. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and Israel fled before them, and many fell slain on Mount Gilboa, right behind us, the setting sun. The Philistines pressed hard after Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically. Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me." But his armor-bearer was terrified and would not do it. Saul took his own sword and fell on it. There's the sad line, isn't it? This man began his career with such promise. You know, he was the tallest Israelite around. He was head and shoulders above anybody else. Good-looking kid. And he had no ambition. That is to say, ambition for power and control. He was a very humble guy from the smallest tribe, Benjamin. His family was not well known, and he certainly wasn't running for office. He was out there just taking care of his sheep and donkeys until Samuel came along and anointed him the first leader. And in that early going, Saul showed some tremendous promise. And then we began to see a very bad pattern develop. In critical moments, he doesn't trust in the Lord. He trusts in his own devices. And sometimes he does that which he is not supposed to do. He actually disobeys the express command of the Lord. That is not a good sign. So that kind of pattern begins to unfold in his life, and at about that time, another young man bursts on the national scene. I'll bet you know his name. If I can use this analogy, and I hope I don't offend anybody by talking about stars, I'm not an astrologist, but as Saul's star begins to descend, we have another star rising. The Lord has already picked out the man after my own heart. That, in a nutshell, is the problem with Saul. He had a heart of his own. And he just couldn't finally turn it all over to the Lord. He's going to always try to save himself somehow, some way. Well, now, I'm going to leave out a lot of the story here. You'll start growing moss if I keep going. But now we come to that last chapter where Saul is really up against it. And he's camped up there in Mount Gilboa, and I'm sorry we can't actually see it and look at it, but during the night, he wants to get a word from the Lord, and he makes a secret, very dangerous actually, mission through Philistine lines to see the witch of Endor. And of course, it's forbidden to consult witches, and Saul knows that. He actually, early in his career, had passed a law that anybody who does this will be put to death, but never mind. In his hour of extremity, the Lord won't speak to him because of Saul's own disobedience, and so he tries to get a word from the witch of Endor, and the Lord gives him a word. And Samuel shows up and says, well, guess what, Saul? You're going to be with me tomorrow, which is a way of saying you're going to die. With that lack of encouragement, Saul is going to face the Philistines the next day, and as the text says here, he went down to defeat. So, don't we wish we could rewrite that story? Give it a great, glorious finish. Saul falling on his knees, calling out to the Lord in like Gideon of old, snatching the victory out of defeat. Well, it didn't happen. He went down. And as a consequence, the Philistines, for a while, are rejoicing greatly. Their hopes for control of this land are just about realized. It says, the next day, when the Philistines came to strip the dead, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head and stripped off his armor. And they sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news in the temple of their idols and among their people. They put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreth, this is a female fertility deity, and fastened his body to the wall of Beit. Can you see it over there? Somewhere up on that mountain toward the upper parts, there was an Iron Age Israelite era fortification city, a city wall. And Saul's body is fastened to it. Final indignity. But that isn't the rest of the story. The rest of the story says that to somehow salvage some dignity out of this awful humiliation, some heroes come on the scene. When the people of Jabesh Gilead heard of what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their valiant men journeyed through the night to Beit. Look to the east. Oh, you can't see. You're not high enough.
We'll look from the visitor center.
When we get to the visitor center, almost straight across the Jordan, in what is today Jordan, up on the heights, Gilead, the little town of Jabesh Gilead, those valiant men all night descended down into the Rift Valley, came up here to Beit Shan, and this takes a lot of courage. They went up and took the body down. They took down the bodies of Saul and his sons from the wall of Beit Shan and went to Jabesh, where they burned them. Then they took their bones, and buried them under a tamarisk tree at Jabesh. And they fasted 7 days. And with that, we have the end of 1 Samuel. Later, David is going to dispatch a delegation, and they're going to retrieve the bones and bring them back to his tribal homeland in Benjamin, and they'll be given a proper burial there. So Saul's, the end of his story is a kind of, it is a tragic reminder that you've got to trust the Lord for the whole course, the whole duration. And good beginnings are not going to compensate for a very weak ending. Now, I guess I've been talking a lot to you about that, folks, because that's sort of where we're at. We're getting at the end of the story. And so you're going to hear a refrain here from me. I'm going to sound like Mozart again with another one of his little refrains. But the refrain is, finish strong. Finish strong. This story of Saul, it doesn't have to happen to us. And we've got to have this contrite and broken heart that's always trusting. And when we get into a corner, we have to say, Lord, save, like Peter said out on the lake. So there's a lot of little threads that come together in all of this. So on a rather somber note, but a note from which we can take some real warning and take it as an admonition to our inner spirit. Keep short accounts with the Lord. Obey Him to the best of our ability. Trust in Him with all your heart. Lean not into your own understanding, and He shall direct your paths.